Good morning. It's still morning, yes. So good morning. My name is Todd Fernando. I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Melbourne. I'm a descendant of the Kalari peoples of the Wiradjuri Nation. I'd like to acknowledge the Kulin people and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present and emerging. I've been living on Naarm for about 5 years, and I've been fortunate enough to teach school students nationally, particularly in New South Wales, Victoria and WA. In the past 4 years, I've been employed by the university as a sessional subject coordinator and lecturer. In a reflection of 10 years, roughly 10 years of being an educator, I'd noticed that there are several conditions confined to teaching and the notion of pedagogy, particularly as an educator of Indigenous descent. For example, the enormity of knowledge systems and indeed the types of belief systems are produced in ways that are both hidden and not hidden. The performances within knowledge production change between gatherings, often dependent on one's access to the room in which knowledge becomes interrogated, established or endorsed. And the architects behind correction or deletion of knowledge, which is usually determined and received racially. This presentation will discuss three key themes. First, we look at the assemblages of Black pedagogy, the role of desire, and how teaching while Black is continually built and remade spatially and temporally. Secondly, we will discuss the sensibilities of Black pedagogy, the role of refusal, and why feelings may be hurt, or why types of fragility exists in the classroom. And finally, we end on the discussion, who should have the last word? This, I want to be an open consultation with you, the audience, if time permits, but we can extend that discussion to after. In 2017, I was engaged by the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Melbourne to be a subject coordinator for Aboriginalities, a foundation subject that was offered primarily to students within arts, but because it's also a breadth subject, students from different disciplines may also enroll. In the year that I was employed, I subsequently requested that the arts employ 5 Aboriginal tutors. It was the first time in the history of the Aboriginalities program that it was an all-Black teaching team. The subject enrolls an average of 230 students per year, mostly white, some international and a handful of Indigenous, but nearly all learning about Australian Indigenous history, theory and concepts for the first time. This subject provided students with an introduction to the complexities and challenges and richness of Australian Indigenous life and cultures. Drawing on a wide range of diverse and dynamic guest lectures, this subject provided students an opportunity to encounter Australian Indigenous knowledges, histories and experiences through interdisciplinary perspectives. Across 3 thematic blocks, Indigenous knowledge, social and political context and representation, self-representation, the subject engaged contemporary cultural and intellectual debates. Social and political contexts are also considered through engagement with specific issues and a focus on Indigenous cultural forms, which may include literature, music, fine arts, exhibitions and performances. The subject allows students to consider self-representation as a means by which to disrupt and expand perceptions of Aboriginality. In that same year, I was employed as a senior tutor and lecturer to teach the Masters of Public Health program within the School of Population and Global Health, while developing the subject Indigenous health in a global context. This was a new subject filled mostly with medical doctoral students, a handful of public health students, again, mostly white, some international, but this time none whom were Indigenous. This is an elective subject in the Masters of Public Health program and contributes to the Indigenous health stream. In this subject, students are introduced to local and global concepts, frameworks and methods used by Indigenous populations to promote health equity and foster a global view of Indigenous people's health and well-being. International studies of the health of the world's almost 400 million Indigenous and tribal peoples provide important public health insights and data that can advance public policy, programs and health services worldwide. Taking into account the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples and sustainability development goals, students in this subject learn how to develop targeted policies and pragmatic responses and how to take preventative action to achieve health equity for populations who experience poor health outcomes. And for 3 years now, I've been a sessional lecturer in the subject Racial Literacy, designed by Odette Collada alongside the support from Diane Jones. This subject aims to enhance students' racial literacy with a focus on representations of indigeneity and whiteness in Australia. The term racial literacy, devised to describe anti-racist practices, entails students becoming literate in critical reading and understanding multiple modes of race representations. This interdisciplinary approach enabled students to analyse the relationships amongst text, images, languages, social practices, drawing on Australian Indigenous literature, media, film and fine arts. In this way, the subject equipped students to become multi-literate, whatever that means, in critiquing race constructions of identity formations and nation building through creative and community arts. The subject also introduced students to critical theoretical frameworks incorporating post-colonial race and whiteness studies. It engaged students to question voice, position, power, agency, capital, and social justice issues to explore how representations of indigeneity and whiteness operate with regard to the intersections of race, gender, and class relations in an Australian context. These three examples of my teaching experience here, just at the University of Melbourne, expanded my understanding of the complexities found within the concept of desire, the assemblages of teaching while Black and Black pedagogy. These experiences showed an intimate desire for students to learn and to listen, to begin a process of decoding and decolonizing and of expansion. One of the duties as an educator is to often hold space for students, Indigenous and not, to submit and come to an understanding of one's own histories, both foreign or domestic, of Indigenous peoples in Australia and indeed globally, and how the perceived other walked through the world. While most students responded well amid their shock and outrage of mistreatment, I noticed that much of the blame of this learning, this new knowledge at a tertiary level, was generally on secondary curriculum, a theme highlighted by many scholars, which is that curriculum plays a significant role in the maintenance of settler colonialism. Though I and others argue that advances in technology do not limit Indigenous knowledge transfer to these students, but rather it is dependent on a will to learn without provocation during high school and throughout university and beyond. The exploration of desire, as shown here by Tuck, highlights a deep necessity for multiplicity. The sharing of knowledge can also be a means for desire from both the giver and the receiver perspective. Indigenous participation in these subjects often spoke from an emotive expression and remembrance about history, and often discussed Indigenous complexity in very personal ways. For me personally, it was a joy to utilise the voice of Indigenous thinkers and doers to commemorate and explore realities and versions of histories that once lay dormant and that was once heard with literal genuine disbelief. The assemblages of Black pedagogy here and through the use of desire permits knowledge to be continually remade and rediscovered rather than continually destroyed, as is so evident in colonial techniques. It is increasingly clear, however, that emotional reactions to knowledge can be both a positive and a hindrance in education, especially for Black educators and Black students. Intersectionally, this argument can be made for people of colour, queer people, queers of colour, among other identities that sit outside frameworks that are considered normal. The layers of Black pedagogy are formed in ways that express a deep desire for interaction. Akin to the definition of Aboriginality offered by Marcia Langton, which she writes is a field of intersubjectivity in that it is remade over and over again in a process of dialogue, of imagination, of representation. She asserts that Aboriginality is not a fixed thing. It arises, she says, from the perspectives from the subjective experiences of both Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people who engage in any intercultural dialogue, whether in actual lived experience or through a mediated experience, such as a white person watching a program about Aboriginal people on television or reading a book. This definition plays a unique role in how we understand the notion and assemblage of Black pedagogy, which is revealed, understood through the use of desire. Similarly, I believe that students who I've taught express desire in ways that propels Tuck's understanding into a realm where their own often whitewashed narratives becomes a space to hold layers. There are, however, some students whom, when presented with a new definition, a new scope, and indeed a new history, fail to confront their own schemas and instead drink the Kool-Aid created by the narratives of their own ancestors. This is often where hindrance to desire comes into play. The outputs of Black teachers propelled by this notion of Black pedagogy are at times real and visceral, particularly at times when students throughout these subjects would often refuse knowledge. This refusal played out in many different performances, something that I would now explore. I was sitting in my geography class. I must have been about 14. My high school teacher was discussing geographical events that separated groups of people across vast distances. I've always been an observant student, often caught up in deep thought, but on this particular lesson, I decided not only just to speak out, but to add to the curriculum. I raised my hand and commented on the disappearance of a land bridge that once connected Tasmania to this big island. I spoke about how Aborigines would probably have crossed seasonally and that their separateness was probably as a result of spiritual belief amongst a natural occurrence. Now, Todd, she retorted, I'm not sure where you got this information from, but I'm not sure it's entirely correct. So let's move on. It is here that I was first introduced to the notion of refusal in knowledge production. Now, I wasn't sure where I got that information from, except that somehow I knew it was a piece of knowledge that I'd learnt long ago and somehow retained. Her soft racism exposed here as she refused and discounted perhaps that it was a knowledge system unfamiliar with her. We would go on to argue about this for the next 10 minutes or so. My argumentative teenage ways would call her out on her ability not to know, not to understand. Frustrated, I was told to leave the classroom as she cited something along the lines of being disruptive. I left her class and headed straight to the library, to the geography section. I stumbled upon a book called The Australian People authored by James Drew. After flicking from page to page, unaware of how to read a title page or an index, I was on a different kind of hunt. On page 110 sat a passage detailing the experiences of Tasmanian Aborigines. I photocopied this page, walked to the office where all the geography and history teachers sat, knocked on the door and said, "Hi, sir. Miss Fletch asked me to photocopy this and put it on her desk. Which one is hers?" I entered the office and followed the point of his finger and cockily placed the photocopied on her very scant desk. There was no way she wouldn't see it. The next day I walked back into her classroom. My head held slightly higher. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, a public apology, a correction, perhaps an acknowledgement. But I received nothing, except that she ignored me not only for that session, but for the remainder of the school semester. Maybe it was my cockiness, or maybe my ability to expose a different version of history she had not been taught. In retrospect, I may never understand how she would have felt except maybe a feeling of shame or embarrassment. Nonetheless, I walked away with a new sense of pride, not in my ability to feel smarter than my teacher, but my ability to know that knowledge extends beyond the limits of the relationship we hold as both teacher and student. That teaching moment has always stayed with me, and I often think about it whenever I enter the classroom as both a teacher and a student. It allows me to think about how we learn and how we teach. Often I remind myself of this experience. In my previous theme, I briefly discussed the complexities that lie in the role of refusal. In my short story here, refusal sat awkwardly, but only between myself as a 14-year-old student and my non-Indigenous high school educator. Refusal, however, became increasingly clear to me throughout my tertiary teaching experiences within the subjects I discussed earlier. As a subject coordinator beyond my role of developing curriculum, I took on a caretaker position for both students and tutors employed within the subject Aboriginalities. Each week I would meet with the tutors to discuss their individual classes. Often in these meetings, we would spend the first 20 minutes or so sharing the positive journeys of our students as they discussed the content or theme of the week. Many tutors would remark the journeys of non-Indigenous people who slowly became those who get it. We would often remark heavily on Indigenous student voices who not only shared their own personal stories, but held significant space while doing so. These Indigenous students would often be the ones in class whom other students looked to for guidance or an answer to an awkward question. But there is often a danger in that request, because for the remainder of my meeting with my tutors, which was about 40 or so minutes, I would often hear stories about students who moved beyond a space of critical thinking into a territory of views and opinions that were plain racist. The navigation of these views often shift the feeling of a room to a place of real awkward and uncomfortable tension. From this position, my tutors would need to navigate this territory in ways that would challenge most teachers. In my meetings with tutors, it was important for me to find scope for them to break and ease the tensions, which is not an easy thing to do. This is where Tuck's understanding of refusal comes into play. Here, Tuck herself provides an interesting perspective on the role of navigating refusal. Tuck's naming of colonial creation stories spark an interesting dialogue, perhaps best encapsulated in Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital, the theory that one group of people's knowledge, typically middle or upper class, has more power than those who do not possess such status. While Bourdieu's work sought to provide a structural critique of social and cultural reproduction, his theory of cultural capital has been used to assert that some communities are culturally wealthy, while others are culturally poor. Applying this concept inside the classroom where the content of knowledge is chiefly held by a Black educator and at times by a Black student, it becomes increasingly clear that the non-Indigenous cultural capital is not deemed as wealthy or as deep as the Black students or educators in these contexts. Perhaps it is here that the sensibilities of teaching while Black, or indeed the role of refusal, is performed, and that this performance is tied to tensions that often result in conflict. So some of the advices that I would give my tutors is that when I encounter these situations, naming the awkwardness tied to knowledge production can sometimes shift tension. For example, a student of mine recently chose to speak about the sensibilities of Indigenous authenticity in a tutorial. She argued that perhaps the notion of geographical location can also necessitate authenticity of indigeneity. Basically, we were discussing if Aboriginal children who grew up in more wealthy areas are considered Black too. Feeling the tension in the room growing, I moved to navigate this by naming the racist ideologies provoked in the idea of material capital, asking her in the class whether or not Black people are entitled to own houses in wealthy suburbs, attend private schools, or wear items of clothing that are perceived to be above a Black person's paycheck. She pondered for a moment and proceeded to tell me that it depends. It was at this point I stopped her and told her that I indeed live in a wealthy Melbourne suburb. I have attended private school, and I do own a few pairs of R.M. Williams and some clothes from Louis Vuitton, so am I somehow less Black? Naming these items could be perceived for her a cultural capital, but it allowed her to think about the ways in which Indigenous people are refused capital based on white cultural outputs. Indigenous students also in the room responded accordingly, but we ended this discussion quickly due to time constraints, and this left a very severe bad taste in my mouth as the necessary unpacking of loaded commentary was no longer available. This revealed to me that desire and refusal plays a very unique role in Black pedagogy, particularly for navigating the notion of the last word. Is having the last word important? Should it rest on Black, brown, or white bodies? Where does the relationship of the last word extend when the discussions are about Indigenous people, about queer people, on gender, or on whiteness? To what extent does the role of the Indigenous or the Black educator play to ease the tensions in a room where in many ways a non-Indigenous educator might find it just a little bit too hard, too awkward, or outside of their comfort zone? The sensibilities of desire and refusal in the idea of the last word results in a feeling of discomfort for both the student and the educator. Does great teaching mean that at the end of every session, every lesson ends with the singing of Kumbaya? Is our aim to walk out of the room feeling great, like we have achieved something? When we do achieve something, do these teaching moments, when we have delivered our content, when we've got our message across, when we walk out with those on our sides who affirm what we've just done, mean that everything is okay? And what does it mean for those who don't walk out feeling the same? Earlier, Dennis spoke about how the spectrum of response kind of is a really interesting way to assess the levels, to assess whether or not people are walking out of your classroom feeling good or feeling bad. It is there in this uncomfortability that even as an Indigenous educator, somehow when I feel great after a lecture, somehow I feel shit. Now, I'm not saying that the sensibilities around upholding or undoing a white gaze solely rests on the Black educator, but instead I asked, where does it actually sit? We often have these conversations in many ways about the notions of, or the ideas of reconciliation, the ideas that white people need to learn Black history. I get it, I agree, they do. But it's increasingly clear that when they have these conversations, we are very much left in an awkward uncomfortability. This tells me that more needs to be done, not to ease the discomforts of white fragility, but to ease the discomforts of any sensibility. When in tutorials, even when delivering lectures, I often scan the room looking for a number of things. The nods of those who are accepting the lessons being taught, the fragile faces of the person who is learning information for the first time, whom on the inside are becoming undone, the faces of absolute shock of those who cannot believe that some histories are as volatile and then that history extends to today. And each time I scan the room, I become reminded by the danger that the danger of the idea that only white people have these feelings. And sometimes, yes, international students and people of colour who play very interesting roles in the project of colonialism are those faces. There are times where the Black face in the audience also extends to the disgust or the emotional response just as much as the white. It is here in the scanning of the room that I'm reminded that the journeys of understanding history is incomplete for everyone. For me personally, in the subjects I discussed earlier, the internal interrogation that occurs in interesting and in many ways is real. While teaching the master's students during that subject, Indigenous Health in a Global Context, listening to Indigenous lecturers who would Skype in from locations that we were discussing. We were discussing several communities overseas. And each and every time I would sit there and have to remind myself that I am learning this information too for the first time, that I am also feeling awkward, that I am also feeling uncomfortable, but that in my role as the Black educator, I have to stand back up and remove my response, remove my emotion, remove my feeling towards the idea that colonialism has been intrusive just as much here in Australia as it is elsewhere. Listening to these deep personal stories that they would tell, the shocking statistics that they would share, the ways in which their unpacking of the experiences was not only mentally draining, but physically painful. In those moments, whether that is hearing stories of Indigenous histories globally or local stories of the country I stood on, it became clear that divorcing oneself from those moments was sometimes necessary and for a number of reasons. It reminded me to reflect on the notion of the last word for a multitude of reasons, because for the Black student, the white student, the Black educator, the white educator, we all have a right to the last word. What ripple effects, however, do those lessons hold? When white students return to their homes, perhaps sitting over dinner with family members who feel comfortable offering racist commentary, how do those students begin to navigate that? Now, I'm not saying that that's the role of the Black educator, but it kind of isn't our role as well. This is what I'm interested in. And during these discussions, and so in our big room discussions, I'd like to know what you think about the idea of the last word and how do we respond to it. Finally, I just wanted to touch quickly on the politics of citation, which it came to me 5 minutes before I came up that I forgot to put it in. For the majority of this session, I only referenced Eve Tuck. Simply because she introduced me to this idea of the politics of citation, amongst other things. And I think it's really important that we think about that, especially in the way in which we're teaching content. Who are we citing? Why are we citing them? What have they provided to us in terms of knowledge? Who do they cite? And this is really important for a number of reasons, because it allows us to grow as Black academics, or us to grow as academics in this space where we can move forward. So to conclude this theme, I'd like to acknowledge the work of gifted and talented women and men who have paved the way for many. The work undertaken to cement a rather winding road must not have been easy. No easy to stand up to those with views who were once openly expressed and accepted. At one point in Australian history, the idea that we, modern Indigenous people, queers, people of colour, are now standing, professing, theorising, producing in a way that sat outside of their thinking. that the thought that we would never or could have never been here, let alone succeed. This is what is reproduced in many ways in the notion of Black pedagogy and the idea of teaching while Black. Finally, I'd like to thank Chelsea and her team for leading such seminal discussions and for cultivating research that should allow us to conduct more important work in the future. Thank you.